Beneath the polished memorials, carefully curated museums, and sanitized textbooks of the Second World War lies a darker layer of history, one that governments on both sides of the conflict fought desperately to bury. Hidden in sealed vaults, erased from public records, and disguised in bureaucratic codenames, these stories survived only in fragments, crumbling dossiers, forgotten interrogation notes, and testimonies of witnesses silenced too soon. Each fragment hints at a version of the war that the world was never meant to see. It was not only a clash of armies and ideologies, but also a theatre of shadow dealings, grotesque experiments, and cold calculations where morality was expendable and human lives were merely data points. From underground chambers in Auschwitz to boardrooms in New York, from Soviet-occupied villages erased from maps to the clandestine sanctuaries offered in Rome, truths too disturbing to acknowledge were carefully concealed. What emerges from the fragments is not a simple narrative of good triumphing over evil, but a chilling portrait of power, pursued at any cost, preserved at any price. These are the disturbingly hidden truths of the Second World War, truths that were never meant to be allowed out, truths that force us to question not only what happened, but why silence was chosen over justice. Chapter 1. Classified Human Experiments Beneath Auschwitz Walls. The image of Auschwitz is one of barbed wire, ash-filled skies, and the ceaseless machinery of mass death. Yet, beneath this horror lay another layer of darkness, one so disturbing that even in the aftermath of the Nuremberg trials, it was omitted, redacted, or buried under the vague heading of classified material. For while the world knows the name Josef Mengele, remembered as the Angel of Death, the full scale of human experimentation at Auschwitz went far beyond one man's sadism. Inside Block 10, under the administration of the SS Hygiene Institute and in cooperation with corporate giants like IG Farben, a hidden war was fought with human bodies as the battlefield. These were not just medical atrocities. They were military experiments, carefully designed trials to weaponize science for total war. Documents seized by Allied intelligence referred cryptically to winter hardness trials or resistance evaluations, but what they described was the deliberate mutilation, infection, and extermination of prisoners to test chemical weapons, sterilization techniques, and endurance to nerve agents like tabun, a compound that would later haunt Cold War stockpiles. The experiments began quietly in late 1941, shortly after the Wehrmacht's disastrous winter campaign against the Soviet Union. Reports indicated that German soldiers were collapsing not only from Soviet firepower, but from frostbite, malnutrition, and exposure. Himmler issued directives demanding solutions that would harden the body of the Aryan soldier and preserve combat effectiveness in extreme climates. The laboratories of Auschwitz became the testing ground. Prisoners, often Soviet POWs and Polish resistance members, were stripped naked and left exposed in sub-zero temperatures, their vital signs carefully recorded until death. Survivors of these sessions, if any, were often subjected to immediate vivisection. Yet the clinical reports rarely used words like prisoner or death. Instead, they referred to units or subjects, reducing human suffering to sterile lines of data. Chemical weapons testing was equally disturbing. In secret chambers adjacent to Crematorium 2, SS doctors introduced trace amounts of tabun gas to captives, observing respiratory collapse, convulsions, and organ failure. Tabun, first synthesized in 1936 by Dr. Gerhard Schrader of IG Farben, was classified as Trilon 83 in wartime correspondence. Though Hitler hesitated to deploy it on battlefields, fearing Allied retaliation, the Reich remained determined to perfect its application. At Auschwitz, prisoners became test instruments. Allied intelligence later uncovered fragments of reports coded under Operation Dustbin, detailing how data from these experiments were confiscated and shipped to Britain and the United States. The information was deemed too valuable to destroy, and instead of full disclosure at Nuremberg, it was buried in military archives, locked away for decades. Perhaps the most grotesque aspect was the sterilization research. Himmler was obsessed with the idea of reducing the reproductive capacity of what he considered inferior populations. Block 10 became the stage for radiation sterilization trials, where women were subjected to high doses of X-rays, often without anesthetic, leaving them permanently scarred. Other programs used chemical injections, caustic substances introduced directly into reproductive organs, causing unbearable agony and certain infertility. Survivors were left broken, their testimonies discounted as unreliable when whispers of their suffering surfaced in displaced persons camps after the war. Official tribunals sanitized these horrors, classifying them under broader charges of medical crimes, without exploring the depth of systemic sterilization programs. The complicity of industrial giants deepens the horror. IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced Zyklon B for the gas chambers, also financed much of the experimentation. Corporate scientists visited Auschwitz under the guise of research delegations, reviewing test protocols and approving methods that would later translate into commercial patents. The boundary between business interests and mass murder dissolved entirely. This collaboration is documented in seized ledgers where prisoner numbers, tattooed on their arms, were used as test identifiers, their fates recorded like experimental batches in a laboratory. These ledgers, partially revealed during the Farben trial of 1947, were so incriminating that entire sections were sealed under Allied economic interests, suppressed to avoid destabilizing post-war industry. Western powers, especially the United States, soon recognized the value of these data. In 1945 and 1946, teams of intelligence officers conducted Operation Paperclip, extracting German scientists from Europe before the Soviets could seize them. While most know of rocket engineers like Werner von Braun, fewer realize that medical specialists implicated in Auschwitz experiments were also quietly absorbed into Western programs. Their findings on hypothermia, chemical resilience, and sterilization were stored in classified repositories, later influencing Cold War research in chemical and biological defense. Justice was sacrificed for strategic gain. Files bearing the stamp U.S. Army, restricted, concealed the identities of men who should have stood trial for crimes against humanity. Instead, they received salaries, laboratories, and new lives under false names. The Soviets, for their part, discovered their own cache of documents when liberating Auschwitz in January 1945. Yet, rather than broadcasting the full scale of atrocities, the NKVD weaponized the evidence selectively. Reports emphasizing German brutality were publicized to reinforce Soviet moral authority, but files implicating Western corporations or suggesting shared culpability were locked away in Moscow. To this day, sections of the Soviet archives remain sealed, ensuring that fragments of Auschwitz's scientific crimes remain in the shadows. Eyewitness accounts that survived are haunting. A Polish nurse, Helena Czajka, recalled in a secret deposition to the Red Cross how women screamed as injections rendered them sterile. Soviet POW Ivan Nikitin testified to being locked naked in a chamber where icy water was poured over his body until unconsciousness, after which doctors revived him only to repeat the process. Yet, many such testimonies were dismissed by tribunals as emotional exaggerations, overshadowed by the overwhelming focus on extermination camps and gas chambers. The deliberate narrowing of the narrative erased the true scope of experimentation. It became convenient to reduce the story of Auschwitz to one of mechanized death, omitting the systematic transformation of human beings into experimental fodder for both science and war. The echoes of these experiments extended long after the camp's liberation. In 1952, British scientists at Porton Down conducted hypothermia trials on servicemen, citing data from German sources as baseline references. In the United States, classified memos from the Edgewood Arsenal mention Consulted Foreign Studies, 1943-1944, a veiled acknowledgement of Auschwitz records. Each line of those memos was written in clinical detachment, but behind them were faces, bodies, and names erased by both Nazis and their successors. The survivors who lived long enough to speak often did so into silence, their stories inconvenient to the geopolitical struggles of the Cold War. What makes this chapter of history so disturbingly hidden is not only the cruelty itself, but the complicity in its erasure. Governments, corporations, and intelligence agencies all chose silence. To acknowledge the experiments fully would have meant implicating not only the perpetrators, but also those who profited from their knowledge. The moral ledger of Auschwitz is not confined to the Reich alone. It stretches into boardrooms, laboratories, and intelligence offices across the world. The secrecy was deliberate, the omissions intentional. In this silence, the dead were denied justice, and the survivors were denied truth. Behind the walls of Auschwitz, beneath the shadows of crematoria smoke, human beings were reduced to data points, and their suffering was transmuted into classified knowledge that shaped a world order built on denial. The chilling reality is this. While monuments today stand to honor Auschwitz's victims, the hidden experiments of Block 10 remain largely unspoken. Files are still redacted, archives remain sealed, and the full ledger of complicity has yet to surface. What lies beneath those walls is not merely history, it is an accusation, one that still waits, unanswered, in the silence of classified vaults. Chapter 2: Forbidden Deal between Reich and Wall Street. Wars are not fought on battlefields alone. Behind the thunder of artillery and the march of armies, there are quieter fronts. The banks, the trade routes, the currency exchanges. In the Second World War, one of the darkest truths remains that the Reich's economy did not collapse in isolation. While bombs fell over Europe, while millions were executed, certain boardrooms in New York, London, and Zurich continued to hum with activity. Declassified records from the Office of Strategic Services marked Operation Safe Haven, reveal coded transfers, shell corporations, and silent partnerships that kept German industry alive long after war had begun. These records tell of forbidden deals, arrangements so politically toxic that Allied leaders chose silence over exposure. At their core was the uncomfortable reality. Parts of the Western financial system, knowingly or unknowingly, enabled the Nazi war machine to function years longer than it might have otherwise. The foundation of this forbidden network lay in Switzerland, the so-called neutral banker of Europe. As early as 1940, Reich officials began depositing looted gold from across occupied territories into Swiss banks. These deposits were melted, recast, and laundered, stamped with neutral insignias, and then released into international circulation. Among these deposits were bars stripped from Jewish victims, their origins erased in furnaces. Operation Safe Haven files, recovered in 1944, reveal ledger entries linking these transactions to both American and British intermediaries. US Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. warned repeatedly of Wall Street's entanglements, pointing directly at institutions that shielded Nazi assets. His memoranda, titled Treasury Investigation of Neutral Accounts, describe a web of transfers disguised as humanitarian aid or industrial trade. Many routed through Swiss clearinghouses with the cooperation of banks whose names remain familiar today. The deals were not limited to gold. German industry relied heavily on American technology and resources in the years before and during the war. Standard Oil of New Jersey, now Exxon, was documented as having provided patents for synthetic fuel processes critical to the Luftwaffe's operations. The Reich's dependence on synthetic fuel was absolute. Without it, the Wehrmacht's blitzkrieg campaigns would have ground to a halt. A 1942 report by the US Department of Justice outlined Standard Oil's ties to IG Farben, the same conglomerate responsible for Zyklon B, yet these findings were buried under the justification of national security. Prosecuting corporate leaders for collaboration would have destabilized wartime production at home, and so the files were quietly sealed. Another disturbing revelation involved communications technology. International Telephone and Telegraph, or ITT, maintained financial interests in Focke-Wulf, the German aircraft manufacturer. During the war, ITT subsidiaries supplied components for fighter planes that battled Allied pilots in the skies. Similarly, Ford Motor Company's German division produced military vehicles for the Wehrmacht. In both cases, executives in the United States claimed ignorance or lack of control, but post-war records reveal steady streams of profits reported back to American headquarters. The dissonance was staggering. Corporations that supplied the US war effort simultaneously profited from Germany's military expansion. In the political climate of the Cold War, these contradictions were erased, sanitized in official histories that painted the conflict in clear moral binaries. Operation Safe Haven was designed to trace and seize Nazi assets before they disappeared permanently into post-war havens. The OSS collected thousands of pages of evidence, detailing transactions routed through Argentina, Portugal, and Turkey. These documents included memoranda labeled confidential, do not release, where Allied intelligence admitted the uncomfortable reality that many corporations had shielded Nazi funds. A report from March 1945 identified Chase Bank in New York as one of the institutions managing German accounts in occupied France. The transactions were disguised as humanitarian remittances, but in reality, they facilitated the transfer of Reichsmarks into stable currencies. By the time Allied troops liberated Paris, much of the wealth had already been siphoned away. Why then did these revelations not dominate the post-war tribunals? The answer lies in the fragile economic balance of the late 1940s. Europe was devastated, its infrastructure shattered, and the looming threat of Soviet expansion overshadowed calls for corporate accountability. The Marshall Plan, launched in 1948, required the cooperation of the very industries implicated in collaboration. To destabilize them with prosecutions would have risked economic collapse. As a result, entire sections of the safe haven files were classified under economic stability interests. Nuremberg prosecutors, under political pressure, focused narrowly on individual Nazi leaders, leaving the broader network of financial complicity untouched. What could not be erased was instead quietly ignored. One haunting example involves the fate of Jewish assets looted by the Reich. Swiss banks, accused of hoarding deposits belonging to Holocaust victims, stonewalled investigators for decades. Survivors and their families sought restitution, but the banks cited lack of documentation, knowing full well that much of the documentation had been deliberately destroyed. It was not until the 1990s, half a century later, that international commissions forced Swiss institutions to acknowledge even a fraction of their involvement. By then, countless survivors had passed away, denied the chance to see justice. The silence had served its purpose, decades of profits safely preserved while the human cost was forgotten. The secrecy extended into intelligence operations. As the Cold War escalated, former Nazis with expertise in finance were recruited by both American and British agencies. Their knowledge of hidden accounts and laundering mechanisms proved useful in covert operations against the Soviet bloc. Files stamped CIA, restricted from the early 1950s, describe efforts to track Soviet gold reserves using techniques pioneered by Nazi bankers. In exchange, many of these men were shielded from prosecution. Justice was sacrificed again on the altar of geopolitical necessity. The same institutions that had profited from war crimes now became tools. In the new struggle for global dominance, the disturbing truth is that the Reich's survival for as long as it did was not simply a matter of military power. It was sustained by a network of financiers, industrialists, and corporate executives who continued to see opportunity where others saw atrocity. These men did not wear uniforms, nor did they stand in dock at Nuremberg. They wore tailored suits, signed contracts, and sat in offices far removed from the front lines. Yet their fingerprints remain on the machinery of war, just as surely as those who pulled the triggers and operated the camps. Their names remain etched not on monuments of remembrance, but in the logos of companies that endure today, largely untarnished in the public eye. The forbidden deal between the Reich and Wall Street was not an isolated event. It was part of a broader pattern, a willingness to overlook atrocity when profit or political advantage was at stake. It was an erasure of accountability, a rewriting of history in which silence became more valuable than truth. The archives of Operation Safe Haven stand as testimony to this reality. Pages of names, dates, and transactions that governments chose to bury. While soldiers fought and civilians died, the war's hidden financiers remained untouched, shielded by power and protected by secrecy. This truth remains disturbing precisely because it complicates the narrative of World War II. It challenges the comforting notion of a clear moral divide between Allies and Axis. It reveals that even in the good war, corruption and complicity thrived in the shadows. The Reich was defeated militarily in 1945, but the networks that sustained it financially were never dismantled. They simply changed names, shifted accounts, and continued into the post-war order. What was presented to the public as victory concealed a deeper, more troubling continuity, that power and profit outweighed justice, and that silence was the true currency of survival. Chapter 3: Erased Soviet Atrocities on German Soil. The end of the Second World War is often remembered in Europe as a moment of liberation. Red Army troops advancing westward are portrayed in triumphal photographs, raising the Soviet flag over the Reichstag in Berlin, shaking hands with Allied counterparts at the Elbe. Yet behind this imagery, behind the propaganda carefully crafted by Stalin's regime and reluctantly echoed by his Western allies, lies another truth. It is a truth written in NKVD interrogation reports, in the testimonies of German civilians, and in the missing persons files of the German Red Cross. It is the truth of atrocities committed not by the defeated Reich, but by the very forces that claim to have liberated Europe. These were crimes that were never allowed into the official narrative, erased under the heavy censorship of Cold War politics. What unfolded on German soil between 1944 and 1947 was not merely victory, it was vengeance, often indistinguishable from terror. The first wave of Soviet retribution began during the Red Army's advance into East Prussia in late 1944. German propaganda had long warned of Bolshevik brutality, and for once, their warnings were not exaggerated. Villages such as Nemmersdorf, a small settlement near Gumbinnen, became infamous for what survivors described as scenes of unrestrained violence. German civilians, many of them women, children, and the elderly, were executed on the spot. Witnesses later described women nailed to barn doors, entire families machine-gunned as they attempted to flee. Soviet war correspondents reported the incident privately, but official Soviet channels dismissed it as fabrications of fascist hysteria. For decades, even discussing Nemmersdorf was taboo in the East German state, its memory outlawed in school curricula and public discourse. Yet the village massacre was not an isolated episode. It was the beginning of a campaign of terror that unfolded across occupied territories. As Soviet troops pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the violence intensified. Red Army commanders, desperate to maintain discipline, issued orders threatening severe punishment for crimes against civilians, yet the orders often went ignored. NKVD reports intercepted by Western intelligence describe entire units participating in mass sexual violence, an atrocity that scarred generations. Historians estimate that more than 2 million German women were raped during the Soviet advance, some repeatedly, others left to die in humiliation and despair. In Berlin alone, as the city fell in April 1945, accounts describe hospitals overflowing not with combat casualties, but with women seeking treatment for injuries inflicted by their supposed liberators. One Soviet officer, later interrogated by his own superiors, admitted that commanders frequently turned a blind eye, reasoning that their troops had earned the right to revenge. The violence extended beyond sexual assault. Entire communities were uprooted and erased in the name of security. Soviet authorities labeled German civilians in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia as potential collaborators, regardless of their individual loyalties. NKVD units rounded up tens of thousands and deported them eastward into forced labor camps. Many were never seen again. The German Red Cross, in post-war reports compiled in the 1950s, documented over 2 million disappearances in the Eastern Territories during this period. The Soviet Union, when confronted with these numbers, dismissed them as Western propaganda. In truth, the NKVD files confirming mass deportations remained sealed in Moscow, hidden in archives that would only begin to open after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. The atrocities were not only physical, but also cultural. Soviet occupation authorities instituted what they termed denazification, but in practice, this often meant the destruction of entire communities. Churches were desecrated, libraries burned, schools dismantled. In cities like Königsberg, later renamed Kaliningrad, Soviet forces systematically dismantled infrastructure, shipping valuable equipment and machinery back to the Soviet Union. The looting was methodical, carried out not by marauding soldiers, but by organized Soviet commissions. Factories were stripped bare, universities emptied of their archives, cultural treasures loaded into trains bound for Moscow and Leningrad. To the Soviet leadership, this was both spoils of war and reparation. To the German civilians left behind, it was annihilation of identity. Why were these atrocities erased from the broader history of the war? The answer lies in the uneasy alliance between East and West. For the Western Allies, the Soviet Union was essential to defeating Hitler. To acknowledge Soviet crimes would have fractured the alliance during the war itself. Afterward, as the Cold War dawned, exposing Soviet atrocities risked escalating tensions at a moment when nuclear confrontation loomed. And so, silence became policy. Reports were redacted, testimonies shelved, and memory reshaped. Even the Nuremberg trials, which meticulously documented Nazi crimes, avoided confronting Soviet atrocities. When defense lawyers attempted to raise the issue, judges swiftly silenced them, deeming such claims irrelevant or unproven. The victor's justice had no room for mutual accountability. The Soviet Union itself ensured silence through fear. Officers who attempted to report crimes committed by their men often found themselves reassigned, imprisoned, or executed. One declassified NKVD memorandum from 1946 describes the trial of Major Ivan S., accused of leaking details of mass executions in Silesia. He was convicted not of the crimes themselves, but of betrayal of state secrets. His fate was typical of those who attempted to speak the truth. The Soviet narrative permitted no blemish on the image of the Red Army as heroic liberators. To question that image was to question Stalin himself, a crime punishable by death. The legacy of these atrocities lingers in silence. Generations of German families carried stories of loved ones lost, of violations endured, but found no place to speak them. In East Germany, the communist regime enforced a rigid narrative of anti-fascist liberation, punishing those who dared recall Soviet crimes. In the West, shame and fear often silenced survivors. Only after the fall of the Berlin Wall did suppressed testimonies begin to resurface, their words echoing like ghosts across decades of denial. By then, many archives had been cleansed, many records destroyed, and many voices permanently silenced by time. Perhaps the most disturbing element of this hidden history is how vengeance blurred into state-sanctioned terror. For the Soviet Union, the atrocities were framed as justice for the suffering inflicted by the Reich. And indeed, the Soviet people had endured unimaginable horrors. 27 million dead, entire cities starved, villages burned. Yet in channeling this grief into unrestrained violence, the Soviet regime perpetuated cycles of trauma that scarred both victor and vanquished. Liberation became indistinguishable from occupation, and the line between justice and atrocity vanished in the smoke of ruined cities. The erased Soviet atrocities on German soil remind us that history, when told by victors, often becomes a weapon. What is remembered and what is forgotten are not accidents. They are choices, deliberate acts of omission shaped by politics and power. The crimes committed during those final years of the war were hidden not because they lacked evidence, but because they threatened narratives too valuable to be questioned. To confront them fully is to confront the uncomfortable truth that liberation can coexist with brutality, and that silence can be as destructive as violence itself. In the ashes of East Prussia and the ruins of Berlin, beneath the triumphant flags and celebratory headlines, another story remained buried, one that forces us to reconsider the cost of forgetting. Chapter 4. Hidden Biological Warfare in Unit 731 Records. In the icy expanse of Manchuria, far from the battlefields of Europe and the well-documented horrors of the Holocaust, another theatre of cruelty operated in almost complete secrecy. It was known within Japanese military files as Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department 731, a name designed to conceal its true purpose. To the outside world, it was presented as a sanitary unit tasked with ensuring the health of the Imperial Army. In reality, it was one of the most sophisticated biological warfare programs ever conceived, overseen by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii of the Kwantung Army. Behind its innocuous cover, Unit 731 conducted experiments so grotesque that even hardened investigators in the post-war years struggled to comprehend their scale. Here, in a series of hidden compounds near Harbin, thousands of prisoners were systematically tortured, dissected alive, and exposed to diseases designed not merely to study infection, but to perfect weapons of mass death. The origins of Unit 731 can be traced back to 1932, during Japan's occupation of Manchuria. The Kwantung Army, eager to expand its strategic dominance, approved Ishii's proposal to explore the potential of bacteriological warfare. The Imperial General Headquarters granted Ishii near-limitless authority, providing land, funding, and human subjects taken from occupied territories. By 1936, the Pingfang facility outside Harbin had grown into a sprawling complex covering over 6 square kilometers, complete with laboratories, barracks, crematoria, and underground prisons. To the Japanese public, the base was invisible. To those who entered its gates as captives, Chinese villagers, Korean forced laborers, Mongolian peasants, Soviet POWs, and even captured Allied pilots, it was a death sentence. Few ever left alive. Inside the compound, the methods of experimentation defied comprehension. Prisoners, referred to in documents only as maruta, or logs, were deliberately infected with pathogens such as plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhoid. The infections were left untreated to observe progression, While victims were restrained in isolation chambers, their vital signs meticulously recorded until death. In other cases, captives were subjected to vivisections without anesthesia, as doctors sliced into living bodies to examine the effects of disease on internal organs in real time. Frostbite experiments, similar to those conducted in Nazi camps, involved exposing limbs to sub-zero temperatures until they froze solid, then attempting crude revival techniques. Survivors were rare. Those who did endure were often executed by lethal injection or dissection once their usefulness expired. What emerged was not medicine, but weaponization. The transformation of human agony into data points for battlefield deployment. Unit 731's research was not confined to laboratories. Ishii's men tested their findings on a grander scale, deploying biological agents in field experiments across Manchuria and China. Villages were deliberately contaminated with plague-infested fleas, spread via ceramic bombs dropped from Japanese aircraft. Crops were poisoned, water supplies infected. Outbreaks that appeared natural were in fact calculated assaults, designed to measure how disease could cripple populations and armies alike. In Zhejiang and Hunan provinces, epidemics erupted mysteriously after Japanese air raids. Later records confirmed these were the results of biological warfare. The victims numbered in the tens of thousands. Yet their suffering was attributed at the time to natural disease, a deception carefully maintained by Japanese authorities. The collapse of Japan in 1945 could have brought Unit 731's crimes fully to light. Instead, what followed was a chilling bargain that ensured silence. As Soviet troops advanced into Manchuria, Ishii ordered the destruction of the Pingfang facility. Buildings were dynamited, records burned, prisoners executed en masse to prevent testimony. Yet not all was lost. The Soviets captured several key personnel and conducted the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in December 1949. There, testimonies revealed the horrors of human experimentation and biological warfare, shocking even hardened observers. But in the West, the trials were dismissed as propaganda. American officials, wary of acknowledging evidence presented by their new Cold War adversary, chose to downplay the revelations. Behind closed doors, the US Army had already struck a deal. Documents, declassified decades later, confirm that General Douglas MacArthur and his staff granted immunity to Ishii and his senior scientists in exchange for their research data. In memos marked top secret, eyes only, US military intelligence emphasized the strategic value of Unit 731's findings for future biological warfare programs. The scientists were quietly relocated, some absorbed into Japanese academia, others into American laboratories. Ishii himself lived freely until his death in 1959, never facing trial. The United States justified this betrayal of justice by arguing that the knowledge gained from Unit 731 could not be replicated through ethical means, and that denying it to the Soviets was imperative. The result was an erasure. While Nazi doctors were executed at Nuremberg for similar crimes, Japanese counterparts were shielded, their atrocities sanitized from official histories. The consequences extended far beyond the immediate post-war years. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean officials accused the United States of deploying biological weapons, an accusation dismissed at the time as communist propaganda. Yet, declassified Soviet archives reveal that these accusations were fueled in part by knowledge of the US acquisition of Unit 731's data. Whether true or exaggerated, the specter of Ishii's legacy haunted Cold War conflicts. Meanwhile, survivors of Unit 731's experiments were left without recognition or compensation. Their suffering remained officially denied by both the Japanese government, which maintained silence, and the American government, which buried evidence in classified vaults. The hidden files of Unit 731 reflect a larger truth, that in the calculus of power, atrocity can become currency. The systematic torture and murder of thousands were not prosecuted as crimes against humanity, but repurposed as assets in a global struggle. Justice was subordinated to strategy, morality to expedience. The West, eager to secure advantage against the Soviets, chose complicity and silence. Japan, rebuilding under American occupation, avoided a reckoning with its darkest chapter. For decades, textbooks omitted Unit 731. Survivors were silenced, and the world moved on as though nothing had happened. Only in the late 20th century did fragments of the truth resurface. Former soldiers confessed on their deathbeds. Leaked documents, long classified, revealed the scale of operations. In 1989, photographs smuggled from archives showed prisoners bound in laboratories, their faces frozen in terror. Survivors, now elderly, came forward in testimonies that shook Japan's conscience. Yet the official response remained muted. The archives of Unit 731 are still incomplete, with many records destroyed and others locked away in American and Japanese repositories. The silence continues, an echo of the original concealment that began in 1945. The hidden biological warfare of Unit 731 is not simply a story of Japanese brutality. It is a story of how the victors of war, those who claimed the mantle of justice, chose secrecy over truth. It is a story of how governments weighed human suffering against the calculus of power and found the suffering expendable. It forces us to ask, what is the value of justice if knowledge purchased through atrocity is deemed more important than accountability? The shadow of Unit 731 lingers not only in the graves of its victims, but in the classified archives of the nations that profited from their agony. It is a chapter of the Second World War so disturbing, so dangerous to admit, that it was buried in silence for decades, a silence that speaks louder than any words of remembrance. Chapter 5: Disturbing Nazi Ratlines, Through Vatican Shadows. The surrender of Germany in May 1945 is often remembered as the moment when justice began its slow pursuit of those responsible for unprecedented crimes. Yet while Allied prosecutors prepared indictments for Nuremberg, and while the world demanded accountability, another story was unfolding in the shadows. It was a story not of prosecution, but of escape, an underground network of routes, documents, and protectors that enabled thousands of Nazis, SS officers, and collaborators to vanish into new lives. These networks would later be known by a single word: Ratlines. At their heart, woven deep into the fabric of Europe's religious and political landscape, was the Vatican. What official histories rarely acknowledge is the scale of ecclesiastical complicity. Behind closed doors, under the cover of humanitarian aid and displaced persons programs, fugitives who should have stood trial for genocide instead received sanctuary, forged papers, and safe passage to distant havens. The Vatican in 1945 was uniquely positioned for such a role. Rome, spared the devastation inflicted on other capitals, became a magnet for millions of displaced persons fleeing war-torn Europe. Amid the chaos of refugee camps and international aid missions, it was possible to disappear, to reinvent oneself, to slip into anonymity. The Vatican's Pontifical Commission for Assistance, created to aid war refugees, became the perfect cover. Priests sympathetic to fleeing Nazis, whether out of ideological alignment, anti-communist fervor, or simple pragmatism, forged baptismal certificates and identity papers. These were then laundered through the International Committee of the Red Cross, which, overwhelmed by the sheer number of displaced persons, issued passports with little verification. For many fugitives, these documents became tickets to freedom, stamped not with swastikas, but with the seal of neutrality. The scale of the operation was staggering. Among the most notorious figures to escape was Adolf Eichmann, architect of the final solution. Using false papers under the name Ricardo Clement, Eichmann moved undetected from a Franciscan monastery in Austria to Genoa, where he boarded a ship bound for Argentina in 1950. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, followed a similar route, sheltered in Italy before finding refuge in Bolivia. Josef Mengele, whose experiments at Auschwitz had reduced human life to raw data, slipped through the same system, evading capture for decades. These men were not isolated cases. They were part of an organized exodus facilitated by clerical networks that extended from Austria to Spain, from Italy to South America. The Allied authorities knew of these escapes. Declassified intelligence files, stamped top secret in 1946 and 1947, reveal growing frustration among US and British agents as known war criminals vanished from camps and detention centers. Codenames like Operation Odessa began appearing in reports, referencing the clandestine organization believed to be orchestrating the smuggling of SS officers. While the Odessa myth has since been debated, the reality of organized networks is undeniable. Allied agents infiltrating Catholic charities in Rome discovered priests openly assisting fugitives, sometimes with the knowledge of senior Vatican officials. Yet prosecutions were rare. The onset of the Cold War created a new calculus. Many of these same fugitives, hardened anti-communists with intelligence experience, were suddenly considered valuable assets in the struggle against the Soviet Union. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, became one of the most prominent destinations. Sympathetic to fascist ideology and eager to recruit European talent, Perón's government opened its doors to thousands of former Nazis. Ships departed from Genoa and Barcelona, carrying fugitives under assumed names, their passage financed by sympathizers in Europe and abroad. Once in Buenos Aires, they were absorbed into new communities, often shielded by local German expatriate networks. Some resumed careers in industry and academia, while others became advisors to Latin American dictatorships. Klaus Barbie would eventually work with Bolivian intelligence, assisting in counterinsurgency operations. The continuity of influence was chilling. Men who had orchestrated terror in Europe now applied their expertise in repression across South America. The Vatican's role remains one of the most controversial aspects of this history. Defenders argue that the Church acted in the chaos of post-war displacement, unable to distinguish guilty from innocent among the millions seeking aid. Yet evidence suggests more deliberate involvement. Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the German College in Rome, openly defended Nazi fugitives, declaring them victims of victor's justice. Hudal personally arranged escape routes, using church resources to secure documents and transport. Other clergy, particularly within Franciscan orders, operated ratlines from monasteries in Austria and northern Italy. Whether motivated by ideology or by fear of communism's rise, their actions directly enabled some of history's most notorious criminals to evade accountability. The silence of Western governments compounded the problem. By the late 1940s, the geopolitical struggle with the Soviet Union overshadowed the pursuit of justice. Former Nazis, especially those with intelligence expertise or technical knowledge, were quietly absorbed into programs run by the CIA and MI6. Reinhard Gehlen, head of Nazi military intelligence on the Eastern Front, was recruited wholesale, his network of spies repurposed against Moscow. While Gehlen's case was public, many others remained hidden, their new lives protected by governments that had once promised justice. The Vatican ratlines were tolerated, even indirectly supported, as the Cold War's logic dictated that old enemies could become new allies against communism. The disturbing reality is that the ratlines were not merely accidental oversights or isolated acts of charity. They were a system organized, deliberate, and effective. They reveal how quickly the pursuit of justice was abandoned once political expedience demanded it. For survivors of the camps, for families who had lost everything, the knowledge that perpetrators lived freely under assumed names in distant lands was a wound that never healed. Justice was denied, not by lack of evidence but by conscious choice, by the prioritization of power over morality. The Vatican archives on this period remain sealed in large part, shielded under layers of diplomatic privilege and church secrecy. What fragments have emerged, through Allied intelligence reports, survivor testimonies, and leaked church documents, paint a picture of complicity that is difficult to ignore. Yet official acknowledgement remains scarce. The ratlines remain, even today, a subject often confined to whispers and conspiracy rather than mainstream history. This is not because the evidence is lacking, but because the truth is too uncomfortable. That while the world demanded justice, some of its most powerful institutions ensured escape. The story of the ratlines is the story of silence weaponized. It is the story of a moral failure disguised as pragmatism, of institutions sworn to righteousness providing refuge to the architects of atrocity. It is also the story of continuity, how ideologies defeated on the battlefield found survival in exile, how men condemned in principle thrived in practice. Beneath the sanctuaries of Rome, beneath the shadows of cathedrals and monasteries, history was rewritten in forged documents and sealed envelopes. The disturbing truth is that the war did not end in May 1945 for many of its perpetrators. It merely shifted into new arenas, sheltered by the very structures that should have condemned them. These ratlines were not just escape routes. They were corridors of denial, passages into a world where justice was postponed indefinitely and silence reigned supreme. The war's end is often framed as the triumph of justice over tyranny, the moment when the world confronted its darkest chapter and vowed never again. Yet, buried beneath the official narrative are files stamped with the language of secrecy, classified, eyes only, top secret. Inside those folders lie truths that were never intended for public view, truths of human experimentation in hidden chambers, of corporate complicity in forbidden deals, of atrocities erased by victors, of biological warfare shielded from justice, and of ratlines that spirited killers into new lives. Each revelation forces us to confront an unsettling reality: that history is not merely what is remembered, but also what is deliberately concealed. When governments, corporations, and even religious institutions chose silence, they did not just hide crimes, they rewrote the very memory of the war. And so, the shadows of the Second World War stretch far beyond 1945, into the Cold War, into our present. The question remains unresolved. If so much was hidden, if justice was so often bargained away, how much of what we think we know about that era is only the version we were allowed to see? Some archives remain sealed. Some witnesses remain unheard. The silence endures.